Archibald, and I'm glad you're here. I'm going to talk about Ars Poetica, a poem by Archibald McLeish. Now, the title is Latin and it means the art of poetry. And Archibald McLeish is not the first person to write a poem about the art of poetry. It actually goes back to a Roman poet, Horace, who wrote a long treatise about what poetry is and what makes a poem and that sort of thing. So Archibald McLeish is picking up that thread, and many poets after him also write their own Ars Poetica. So you'll see this title around a lot, and that's why I have to tell you the poet's name to know which poem I'm referring to. Also, this is a whole little genre of poems about poetry. And sometimes people criticize this and say, oh, poets should, why are they like looking at their own work in this kind of meta way? A poem about poetry is sort of like too academic. But I think you'll find that this poem is actually, it's actually against the academic view of poetry. It's against making poems seem like little machines that you can just tinker with and analyze to death. So that's kind of fun and goes counter to expectations. This poem does. So that's one of the reasons I want to read it to you right now. Ars Poetica. A poem should be palpable and mute as a globed fruit, dumb as old medallions to the thumb, silent as the sleeve-worn stone of casement ledges where the moss has grown. A poem should be wordless as the flight of birds. Okay, I'm going to stop there. That's the first little section. That's 4 couplets. He's written this in sets of 2 lines. And actually, you might not have noticed, but there's some rhyme going on. Mute, fruit. So a poem should be palpable and mute as a globed fruit, mute fruit. Dumb as an old medallion to the thumb, dumb thumb. And then you have sleeve-worn stone, grown. Wordless and birds doesn't quite rhyme, but it's sort of close. So these opening lines are surprising because he's saying a poem should be mute, meaning doesn't talk to you. The word dumb here means the same thing. Not talking, unable to talk, or wordless, mute, right? And he's using all of those words. Silent and wordless. Well, obviously a poem is built of words, and so for him to say a poem should be wordless is surprising. So what is he saying here? Here's my reading today. The idea that a poem should be like a globed fruit. That, fruit is, it's a whole thing that you enjoy that has its own flavor, but if it's palpable, it's like the poem should be an object that you enjoy and that's almost a physical object, so that it should exist more in images than in ideas. It should be more concrete. It should feel like a real object in the world, and with all the sweetness and potential that you think of fruit. It's kind of juicy. It's filled with something, and a poem maybe should be filled with something, but not some heady thing, intellectual thing, something sensory. And then dumb as old medallions to the thumb. Okay, so dumb means not talking. Medallions, I was referring to like metal medals. So I think of a medallion as like hanging from a ribbon, like an award you get or something. But the medallions that you would have in your pocket would be the kind that you might rub with your thumb. And maybe your thumb would actually get to know that medallion. So he's hoping a poem will be like that, like a heavy, interesting object in your pocket that your hand knows. It's not a head thing. It's again, sensory thing. It's a heavy, valuable thing, a medallion. that you can really touch. He's hoping then that poems will be silent as the sleeve-worn stone of casement ledges. Wait a second, what is a ledge? What is a casement? It's a windowsill. So, you have a stone windowsill, and then it's referring to the outer sill. So not the part that sticks into the room, but the part that sticks outside. And then your sleeves, if you lean on that window a lot, then the stone like wears away and softens a bit from being worn out by someone's arms being there all the time, like looking out the window. So the sleeve-worn stone of casement ledges, he thinks poems should be like that and should be silent like that. And listen to all the S's: silent, sleeve-worn, stone, casement, ledges, where the moss has grown. So this adds sort of a, to me, when you have moss growing, it harkens to a past, it harkens to time going by. Moss has had time to grow. It's beautiful. It's a little bit worn. I think about, stone buildings that are crumbling or something. It's kind of picturesque. Poems should be like that. So he is talking very much in images, and indeed he writes usually in images. He is famous for images, and I think he hopes a poem will be as vivid, as touchable, tangible, palpable, and as these kinds of things: fruit, a ledge of a window that's been worn away by someone leaning on it, and medallions, old medallions. These are the kinds of things he would compare to what a real poem is. Okay, and then the last, where I stopped, was a poem should be wordless as the flight of birds. So you can picture birds across the sky, right? Flying across the sky, maybe in formation, or maybe just one bird in flight. That's what he hopes a poem feels like. Maybe that's how a poem affects the reader, the idea of flight of birds. But again, it's an image. It's something you can see in your head, and you can call upon memories of birds that have flown, and you can remember how that feels. He wants a poem to be like that. Okay, now the next section, he's still writing in couplets the entire way here. A poem should be motionless in time, as the moon climbs, leaving as the moon releases twig by twig the night-entangled trees, leaving as the moon behind the winter leaves, memory by memory, the mind. A poem should be motionless in time, as the moon climbs. Ooh, okay. This is a little, I think, a little harder to unpack, and he's repeating himself twice. He has this: a poem should be motionless in time as the moon climbs. So, okay, so a poem should be timeless. That is, a poem should speak to you now, just as it spoke to generations of the past, as it will speak to generations of the future. That could be part of the meaning here. It should be motionless in time, but then as the moon climbs. So picture the moon, ascending. That something about how the moon climbs, and maybe because the moon has, throughout human history, has always been something we all see. Maybe that is part of the meaning here, that a poem should be like that, timeless in the sense that all generations see, appreciate, and wonder at that scene of the moon rising. So the moon climbs, and notice how time and climb rhyme. Leaving. Okay, so the poem should leave, but then we have this: as the moon releases twig by twig the night entangled trees. Okay, so the trees are entangled in the dark in the night, but as the moon comes up behind the trees, the twigs are suddenly visible, right, against light of the moon. So the moon sort of reveals the twigs and pulls them out of the darkness and suddenly makes them visible. Yes. Uh, so the night entangled trees, the moon releases twig by twig. So it's an unveiling almost. Maybe that's how a poem comes to the poet, or maybe that's how a poem reveals itself to the reader. I don't know. And then he says, leaving again. So the poem should be motionless, leaving as the moon behind the winter leaves. Okay, so we've also had trees and leaves, which are not in the same couplet, but they have a little sonic, a little assonance, almost rhyme as well. Okay, so the winter behind the moon behind the winter leaves. Again, similar to our twig by twig thing. The moon sets off now the winter leaves. But since they're winter leaves, it feels like this is a more poetic image and a more surprising image than like spring leaves. Of course, we'd have spring leaves, but the moon is so big in the fall and the winter, and it reveals the winter leaves now. And I'm expecting maybe those brown leaves that are still clinging to the branch, that is something the moon reveals. And the next line is memory by memory, the mind, and there's a dash. It's almost like he's interrupting himself to go back and say the next line, a poem should be motionless in time as the moon climbs. I feel like memory by memory is that process, that unfolding of a poem as the poet puts down the memories. And it also is triggering memories and associations for the reader slowly, slowly. And maybe this emphasis on memory, on the past, is appropriate for winter also, because winter is a time of reflection, of looking back, it's not new growth and new experiences, it's memory that we're focused on. And to me, winter speaks of past, thinking of the past. So a poem should be motionless in time, possibly kind of timeless, just like the moon is timeless to all humanity across time, and how the moon reveals things, twig by twig, leaves, and memory by memory, the mind creates the poem, or maybe recreates the poem in the mind of the reader. This is what I take from it. I'd be curious to hear other ideas. You can leave them in the comments. Now this next section and last section of the poem. A poem should be equal to, not true. For all the history of grief, an empty doorway and a maple leaf. For love, the leaning grasses and two lights above the sea. A poem should not mean, but be. Whoa, okay. So this is even more abstract. So we started very concrete, like a poem should be a fruit, should be a medallion, should be like a concrete ledge. Now, and then, later a poem should be timeless, kind of like the moon. But now a poem should be equal to, and then he has a colon, not true. So maybe he's asserting that poems don't deal with truth with a capital T. The poem is not going to instruct and teach directly. A poem is going to simply exist. It's going to be, as the last line talks about, and in its that object in the world, the poem itself is going to mean something, but he says it shouldn't mean but be. Like, its business is not to be meaning stuff. Its business is to be. And again, it makes sense that he's focused on images so much. That fruit, that medallion, it just needs to be in the world, and then people can take from it what they want. But let me go back to the line, a poem should be equal to, not true. So yeah, true as in telling some truth. Maybe that's not the poem's responsibility for McLeish. Maybe equal to might mean clarity of expression. Like the poem is up to the challenge of capturing an image, capturing an experience, capturing a scene. That's what the poem should strive to do. It's like to be equal to the situation, to to be able to capture it or express it, describe it. Um, Maybe that's what that means to be equal to. To me, it feels like the poem takes on the challenge of of being something interesting, you know. All right, or equal to the task of existing in this world, you know, being part of this life. I don't know. It's squishy. It's hard to grasp, but these are the thoughts that come to my mind. Okay, so the poem's not worried about being true or dealing in absolutes or truths, but is equal to. And then he has an example for all the history of grief. A poem can simply show you an empty doorway and a maple leaf. These things can be symbols of, or stand ins, or they can trigger grief, associations about grief. For the whole history of grief, you can just show an open doorway. For love, so instead of here's all about love, I'm going to talk about love in my poem, instead of that talking, we're going to have leaning grasses and two lights above the sea. For sure, two lights make you think of a very special relationship or something, but like two, and light, yeah, above the sea. And then the grasses, you know, leaning grasses, I'm thinking that they're leaning toward each other, and that's love. But I've also seen folks, you know, perceive this differently and think about grasses that lean, you know, kind of receive the wind. And this is, the love is kind of like that. Like you allow love to bend you and wave you, and you know, you enter the flow of love. Hmm. To me, the leaning is leaning toward, and so the grasses like lean together and coming together because there's love somehow. Um, but anyways, he's saying, McLeish is saying, that a poet, instead of talking about love, can just show the two lights over the sea. And the final two lines, very famous: a poem should not mean, but be. So for him, the poem should exist as this object that exudes itself, right? And probably it's built of mostly images, experiences for the senses that are taken in by the reader directly without a lot of interpretive teaching and preaching going on. Instead of meaning this and meaning that, it should just be. Okay. Well, it's ironic that here I am giving an explanation of this poem that's, and the poem itself is kind of arguing against a lot of explaining. But I hope you enjoyed it anyway. Join me for another poem. I hope to keep talking about poems for a little while here and do a little series of poems I'm reading. Okay, cheers.